Hello everybody, Julian Charles here of themindrenewed.com, podcasting to you from the depths of the Lancashire countryside here in the UK. Today is the 17th of May 2013, and I'm very pleased indeed to be speaking to Professor Edgar Andrews, who is Emeritus Professor of Materials at the University of London in the UK, and an internationally acknowledged expert on the science of large molecules. In the late 1960s, Professor Andrews set up the Department of Materials at Queen Mary College, where he served first as head of department and later as Dean of Engineering. In addition to over 100 scientific research papers and books, his publications also include Bible commentaries and various works on science and religion and theology. In 1986, he was brave enough to debate Richard Dawkins at the Oxford Union, about which I shall certainly be asking in a moment, and he is currently acting pastor of the campus church Welwyn Garden City in Hertfordshire. So, Professor Andrews, may I welcome you to The Mind Renewed, and thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Oh, well, thank you very much for your invitation to take part.
Now, when I first contacted you, I said that I would very much like to ask you about your book, Who Made God, and about your life as a scientist and a Christian. But that was before I was reminded that you'd had this debate with Richard Dawkins, so I'd like to take the opportunity to ask you about that as well.
Okay.
But before we get on to that in any detail, could I ask you first to tell us a little bit more about your life and your work?
Well, it's a long story, of course, as I'm 80 years old. A lot of water has gone under the bridge during that time. I'll start with my university experience. I began to study physics as an 18-year-old student at University College London, and it was at the end of the first year at university that I became a Christian. And I had been going to church recently, but for social reasons rather than any spiritual interest. But I suddenly received a very compulsive desire to read the New Testament, something I had not been interested in before. And I began to read from page 1. And it was as I read through the Gospels in the New Testament that I discovered that Jesus Christ was a living person. And at times I even felt his presence there in the room with me. And as I read, I became convinced not only that he was even now a living person, but that he was the one who had died on the cross to forgive my sins and had risen from the dead to vindicate his work upon the cross. In other words, I was converted not by the activity of any other person, but directly by reading the New Testament scriptures. Mm-hmm. Then I went on to complete my undergraduate degree in physics, and I obtained a first-class honors degree at the end of that time. And it was my desire not to go into research, but to get into industry and management. And I tried to do that, but it didn't work because the company I applied to and who employed me immediately put me into research. So I got into a life of scientific research in that way, and I spent just 2 years with them. I would have stayed longer, but they moved their headquarters up to Yorkshire, and I had by that time become involved in the conduct and operation of a small local Baptist church. And I felt I should not leave the church. I should leave my job rather than give up my Christian work. So I found another job with a research company, and I spent 8 years with them, very productive years, and was able to publish quite a lot of material in the scientific journals. And that publication record was sufficient to gain me the place of a reader in materials science at Queen Mary College, as it was then called, part of the University of London. And I was charged with the job of establishing a department of materials science. I became the first professor of materials, and I served as the head of department for something like 13 years. And I was, for over 30 years, I was a consultant to the Dow Chemical Company in the USA and to the 3M company also there. But then another opportunity opened up as I was asked to act as an expert witness in the British High Court in respect of patent cases and product liability cases. And then finally, throughout that time, I've been writing books, trying to help people to understand Scripture and particularly to understand the relationship between science and religion, because so often science is put forward as anti-religion and religion as anti-science.
Indeed, yes.
Well, that is nonsense, of course, because many scientists are Christians. I've been trying to make that clear in some of the books that I've written.
And have you felt over the years that your work actually as a scientist has been a calling?
I believe that my life and my various experiences have been ordered by God. And so, yes, in that sense, everything I have done, I have considered to be, in one sense or another, a calling from God.
And your experience in science has allowed you to write and publish with regard to the science-faith debate and help people in that way?
Well, that's right, because there aren't many people who have experience and knowledge in both science and theology. There are some, of course, but the opportunity I have had has been to write material that help to clarify these matters for the layman. That's been my main emphasis, that I've been trying to explain technical matters to people who don't have a technical background.
Yes, indeed. And I'm going to ask you about your book in a few minutes, which I think is an excellent example of how that can be done. But as I said, I'd like to ask you, I'm really itching to ask you about this debate that you had with Richard Dawkins back in 1986. Now, this was the Huxley Memorial Debate at the Oxford Union, in which you and the pharmacologist Arthur Ernest Wilder Smith were pitted against Richard Dawkins and the geneticist John Maynard Smith, and you were debating whether the doctrine of creation is more valid than the theory of evolution. So I'd really like you to give us an idea of how that debate went.
Well, it was a very interesting experience, I must say. I suppose there must have been at least 250 people present. And these debates, the audience changes. People come and go because they last for hours. The rules they follow at the Oxford Union, or that they followed in those days, were that the seconder of the motion, which was myself, would speak first. I think we had something like 25 minutes to present our case. And then that was followed by Richard Dawkins, who was seconding the opposition to the motion. And then the other two speakers, who were the proposer and opposer in chief, finished up the debate. Having the opportunity to start the debate had advantages and disadvantages. First of all, of course, I had no idea what the other people were going to say. But also it meant that I had a clean slate. And I took the line that science is not able by its very nature to explain everything. And therefore there were things that lay beyond the competence of science to explain, and that those things are explicable and best explained indeed in terms of theology, in terms of the existence of a God who created all things and who also maintains and sustains all things. So I spelled out the various areas in which I felt science was incapable, not because it hasn't reached a sufficient state of advancement, but science was incapable of explaining by virtue of its very nature and the nature of the phenomena concerned.
Indeed, and this is something that you also bring out in your book, so I'm going to ask you about that in a moment as well. Weren't you somewhat surprised by the outcome of this debate?
Well, there were a number of surprising things, in fact. One of them was that during his contribution, Richard Dawkins actually praised a book that I'd written. The book was called From Nothing to Nature and was written from a creationist viewpoint. But he praised it as being well written, although, of course, he didn't believe a thing that was in it. That raised quite a laugh. And I think the problem he had was that he had expected me to base my presentation on the book. Of course, I didn't do that. I went for a completely different position, philosophical position, if you like, in which I outlined the limitations of science and that we must not expect science to be able to explain the universe, life, and everything. So I think he was caught off his guard. He was on the wrong foot and wasn't able to respond in any way to my arguments.
He sounds as if he was a little bit more relaxed in those days. I get the impression that he's a very angry man these days. Was he like that in the debate?
Well, that is another interesting factor. He was, in fact, quite polite and reasonable in the exchanges that he and I had, not only during the debate, but also in the recesses, the coffee breaks. I found him a reasonable man, and I actually thanked him for being reasonable, which could not be said of the other speaker speaking against the motion. He has changed a great deal since then. There was nothing of this bitterness against religion, nothing of the ridicule that he tries now to pour upon those who believe in God and in the whole concept of creation. That was completely absent.
That must have made for a much more interesting debate than he would conduct these days.
Well, I think so. Yes, I think so, because it wasn't clouded by ad hominem attitudes.
Sure.
But, of course, the outcome that you referred to earlier was a little surprising because the evolutionists didn't win the debate with the overwhelming majority that was expected. In fact, the actual result is strictly unknown because although we have it on a tape recording read out by the chairperson, the recording is not totally clear. It was something like 195 against the motion, that is for evolution, and either 115 for creation, or possibly, some argue, 150. 150. That matter is unresolved, and the minute book in which the result should have been recorded was subsequently lost or stolen, disappeared. And the other point was that although in those days the Oxford Union debate was always featured in the national press the following day, it didn't happen with this debate. There was no mention. So we're pretty clear in our minds that the union specifically requested that the debate should not be reported and that the results should not be reported. So we think there was a little bit of skullduggery involved there, but it's very difficult to prove these matters.
It does sound like it. And I understand that this recording is actually available even today, isn't it? So that people could listen to it and decide for themselves whether they think it was 115 or 150.
Yes. All they need to do is put Huxley Memorial Debate into their search engine, and they'll come up with recordings that can be listened to at your computer. So it's not inaccessible at all.
No, I shall put a link to that in the show notes. Now, as I said, I'd like to ask you also about your book, which is Who Made God? Searching for a Theory of Everything, which was published in 2009. And I have to say that before you kindly sent me a copy, I was rather expecting it to be essentially another rebuttal to the writings of the so-called New Atheists. But I have to say that though you do rebut physicist Victor Stenger, I was pleasantly surprised to find that it was much, much more than just a response to the New Atheists, that you in fact make a positive case in the book for the existence of God. So could you introduce us to the book and tell us what it was really that motivated you to write it in the way that you did, because it's certainly a very, very approachable piece of writing.
Yes, there was a specific reason. The book is designed, or the style is designed, shall I say, to be comprehensible and even entertaining for the person in the street who's not a scientist, but who has, and this is the key feature that stimulated me to write the book, who has been exposed to an endless stream of atheistic propaganda via the mass media. especially the BBC,
Yes.
who have given Richard Dawkins several series of his own to promote his atheistical beliefs.
Indeed.
The background assumption in all BBC science and nature programs that there is no place for God or for creation, that is sometimes subtle, sometimes more obvious. Many of the leading newspapers also, Times in particular, have backed Richard Dawkins, given him a tremendous amount of free publicity, and will not, of course, even look at doing a review, even a hostile review of books like my own. Anyway, we have a situation in which there is wall-to-wall coverage in the mass media of atheistical positions.
Absolutely.
Sometimes a little nod in the direction of God, but nothing much more than that. And the person in the street and the child in the classroom have been exposed to this now increasingly for several decades, but particularly in the last few years. And how do you respond to this? You cannot get a hearing in the media anymore. Going back 20 years or so, I was able to participate in one or two broadcasts on local radio and national radio, and even one appearance on Newsnight on BBC television. But you can't even get a reply or an acknowledgement from the mass media today. It's just impossible. So what do? Well, the only thing you can do is to write a book, which, as you say, sets out, if you like, the case for God and for creation, and it is written for the very people who are subjected to this saturation coverage, as I say, of atheism. So it had to be for the layman, it had to be something they could understand, and yet it had to be also of sufficient depth and rationality, if you like, to avoid it being rubbished in reviews. So it was quite a challenge, but it was a challenge that I feel I was able to meet.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think it's very well done indeed. And I suspect that your years of teaching, and you're also a preacher, I suspect that that has something to do with the way that you convey the information through, you have humour and you have illustration and many techniques that you use which make it very easy to follow and very enjoyable to read. But all the time, of course, you're picking up on the message as well that you're conveying. So how is the book actually doing? Has it had much of an impact?
As a Christian book, it has done very well in the USA and in Britain, Australia, generally internationally. Probably sold about 25,000 copies, which for a Christian book is quite a respectable figure.
But is it getting into the mainstream bookshops?
Well, that you see is the other side of the coin. It has not broken into the mainstream, which makes me sad. But what has turned out to be the case, I think, is that it has had a very positive effect for Christians, for theists, and particularly for Christians, who have been encouraged by it to realize that they can stand up to the new atheists and to the propaganda stream that I referred to earlier on. That there are Christian answers based in sound science and sound reasoning and address many of the issues and questions that people have in a very rational way, but also in a very biblical way. I mean, one of the features of the religious scene today is that many of the people who write against the new atheist, like Richard Dawkins, writing very good rebuttals, but themselves are not Bible believers. They attack atheism very well, but they don't really put anything that is really Christian in its place. Now, that is what I have tried to do. How far I've succeeded, I don't know, but I do know that it has been a real encouragement to many Christians.
And I must ask you why you called it Who Made God? I mean, my suspicion is that that's partly your response to those people who seem to think that they have a ready-made knockdown argument. You know, if they're ever debating the existence of God, all they need to do is to say, well, yeah, but who made God? And that's the end of the issue. Am I right? Is that why you chose the title?
Yeah, yes, it is the question that atheists ask. And of course, They don't ask it as a question. It's a rhetorical question. It's a statement. In other words, who made God? That's a question that you cannot answer.
Yes.
That is their approach. Richard Dawkins, in his best-selling book, The God Delusion, asks the question repeatedly in different ways, not necessarily in those very same words, but it's something he returns to again and again and again. And so it seemed to me a good question to put on the front of a book, because so many people ask it. If you like, the title of a book is a shop window, isn't it? It's there to attract people's attention and make them look a little more closely.
And you deconstruct the question itself, don't you, and show how really it's a circular question. That's
right, yes. In a sense, a Christian can answer the question in about 5 seconds flat. Nobody made God. God is self-existent, otherwise he wouldn't be God. So you don't need a book really to answer the question. I simply use the question as a springboard for launching into what you described earlier as a positive presentation, often in scientific terms, of the reality of God and of the reasonableness of faith in the biblical God.
Yes, and the case that you make is you develop this idea of the God hypothesis, and in building the case, before you actually come to the hypothesis itself, you address the question, can science explain everything? This is in chapter 2, which you intriguingly call yogurt, cereal and toast, which I'll have to ask you why you call it that. And you don't mention him, but somebody who immediately came to my mind was the Oxford chemist Peter Atkins, who has stated many, many times that he believes one day science will be able to explain absolutely everything. It's just a matter of time, and science will do the job. So could you tell us why you feel that science will not, in principle, be able to explain absolutely everything?
Yes, this really goes back to the Oxford Union debate in one sense. The 4 things I said then, and I repeat this in the book at much greater length, of course, the 4 things that science, by its very nature, will never explain are, first of all, the origin of all things, origin of the universe. Secondly, the origin of scientific or natural law, the laws that govern the way the universe operates. Thirdly, the origin of life. And fourthly, the origin of mind. The reason that science will never explain the origin of the universe is that science is based upon the laws that govern the universe. There would be no science if there were no laws that were operating continually and in every place. So the laws of nature are the data and the ground of science. Now, I'll come to them in just a moment, but the point is this, that the laws of science are part of the created order. Now, of course, 100 years ago, people thought that there was no beginning to the universe. They thought the universe had always been there. But we know now that scientific evidence is that the universe did have a beginning, the so-called Big Bang. Now, whether the standard model of the universe, Big Bang theory, is correct in all its details is still under debate. But nevertheless, there's no question that the universe had a beginning, and people who don't believe in creation are trying very hard to get around that, but I don't think you can. Now, if the laws of nature are a description of the way the universe works, which is what they are, then before there was a universe, there could have been no laws of nature. And that being the case, science, which depends upon explicating and investigating the laws of nature, really has nothing to say about what was there before the universe was there. In other words, it has nothing to say about how the universe came into existence. Science can theoretically at least trace the origin of the universe back to the first microsecond, if you like, but they can't go back beyond the time zero, beyond the beginning of the universe, and therefore they can never scientifically explain what caused the universe to come into existence. So that's the first point. The second point is the laws of nature. The laws of nature are really remarkable. in that they are mathematical. I speak as a physicist, of course. Essentially, the laws of nature, or the descriptions that we put up to describe and to some degree explain how the universe operates, are mathematical. Now, that's a great curiosity, because why is mathematics something which has been developed by humans and human minds? Why is mathematics anything to do with the nature of the universe? The universe has been created, said one cosmologist, by a mathematician. It seems to me that the laws of nature have to be taken as granted by science. We discover them, we investigate them, we put them to use in technology. We often work upon them so as to gain a more sophisticated knowledge of them. The famous search for a theory of everything, of course, is the holy grail of physics, to find a theory, a physical theory, from which all other physical theories can be derived. An overarching explanation, if you like.
But even that wouldn't be a total explanation. In popular imagination, that really is an explanation of absolutely everything. But even that, even if it united the various aspects of physics that need to be understood, that wouldn't explain everything even then, would it?
Well, that's right. It would only explain everything in the physical material universe. But even so, even if such a theory were developed and proven to be successful, you've still got to ask, well, where did that theory come from? Where did that law of nature come from? What brought the laws of nature into existence?
But there are people, are there not, who speculate that perhaps there are some kinds of cosmic Darwinian processes by which the laws of nature evolve into being. Do you give any of those credence at all?
No, none whatsoever. In fact, that cannot possibly be the case. All the scientific investigations into the nature of the cosmos, all cosmology, depends upon us being able to rely upon the fact that the laws of nature always were what they are now. Now, there is something that has been promoted and is perfectly legitimate, and that is the idea that you have a law of nature. Let's take the laws of force, just to make it a little more clear. There are four forces in nature that have been studied. The strong force, which holds atoms together, the weak force that pulls them apart, the electromagnetic force, which controls electricity and magnetism, or which functions in those phenomena, and finally the force of gravity. Now, for a long time, people have been trying to unify these forces into a single theory, and they've had some success. For example, the weak force and the electromagnetic force can be represented as having derived from a single force kind in the early stages of the evolution of the universe. The idea is that forces which once were a single force became different types of force as the universe cooled down from the Big Bang. And so it is possible, as I say, to produce these theories of everything, or partial theories of everything, which embrace and break down into other laws, which are the ones we recognize today. In that sense, there has been, or could have been, a change in the nature of the laws of science, but it's not really a change. It's simply a separation of things that were implicit in the original law. Now, that is not evolution in any Darwinian sense. Evolution in a Darwinian sense doesn't speak of splitting out the various components of one overarching reality with the progress of time. In fact, that's much more like creationism. Darwinianism believes that new structures and more complex systems can evolve from simpler ones, whereas the things we're talking about in cosmology are simpler things devolving from more complex or all-embracing theories. So it's really quite the opposite.
It's interesting that what you say there seems to chime in my mind with something that I believe it was St. Augustine said, that the creation had potentialities that unfolded through time,
Yes.
which is very different, as you say, from the Darwinian aspect. The third thing that you point to is the origin of life, where you say that the naturalistic science won't be able to explain that either.
Well, that's right. And the reason I maintain that is not a chemical reason, although there are lots of chemical reasons why life, as we know it, the chemistry of life, could not have arisen spontaneously. And I do go into those in the book. But the ultimate reason why I say that life can never be explained on purely scientific grounds is that the essence of life, the fundamental characteristic of life, is information. DNA has written upon it a language, a code. It uses a code, just as we use an alphabetical code, to write messages. And that code and those messages or instructions are written upon the DNA molecules, and then they're reproduced from that to perform their functions in the living cell. Well, now, science cannot explain the origin of information. Information just does not happen. The only origin we know of, scientifically or in any other way, the only origin for information is intelligence, is mind. And it is the complete inability of random chemical or physical processes to generate information that means, in my mind at least, that we shall never, ever explain the origin of life scientifically. Now, people will deny that, and they're working very hard on finding ways in which information could have been generated accidentally by random or chaotic processes. But they'll never have any success, in my view, because of the nature of information. Mm-hmm. It has its origin in mind.
Are you at this point employing the God hypothesis that you develop in the book? Because it seems to me that you're saying that one of the predictions of the God hypothesis is that there will be these limitations, that we will find ourselves running up against these limitations of naturalistic science, and that when we find those limitations and they persist, no matter how much research we engage in, they persist. This then serves to confirm the hypothesis. Is that how your logic works with this?
Yes, I would perhaps put it a little bit differently. I would say that we have the God hypothesis, and of course I use the word hypothesis in a strong sense, a foundation on which to build our ideas and our understanding of the universe. We have the God hypothesis, which when it comes to these issues we've been discussing that science really can't handle, provide us with a very rational and, what is more, a unified picture. You see, it's quite possible for the atheist to come up with explanations for certain phenomena. Let me take an obvious example. The fine-tuning of the universe that makes it suitable for life. Even evolutionists say, well, life has evolved because the universe is fine-tuned to accommodate that process. So the fine-tuning of the universe is not disputed, or not strongly disputed. I do know one or two books which try to dispute it, but nobody really denies that the universe is fine-tuned or finely tuned to support the existence of intelligent life or life of any kind. Now, the creationist, a person like myself, will say, well, of course it's fine-tuned. Of course it's suitable for the existence of life because that's the way God designed it to be. Now, the atheist comes back and says, oh, well, no, what we have to take into account is there is not just one universe, but there is a multiverse. In other words, there are untold millions of different universes. Of course, we only know about one, the one in which we live, but there are lots and lots of others. And sooner or later, just by accident, among this vast number of different universes, there will be one universe where things are just right for intelligent life to exist. And that happens to be ours. And so they offer the multiverse as an argument against creation. So they have an answer. And when you come up against other things, I won't go further, but there are other points where we say, well, that demonstrates the reality of creation. And they say, oh, no, I have an alternative explanation. But each of the atheistic interpretations or explanations is an ad hoc one.
Aha, yes.
It doesn't bear any relationship to the previous explanation of the previous phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And so whenever you come up with one of these arguments for creation, they'll say, well, we've got an answer to that. But those answers are incoherent. In other words, they don't hang together. They don't have a single source. Whereas the hypothesis of God provides us with a single explanation for all of these things. And that, to my mind, is philosophically much more satisfying and therefore much more likely to be true.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. It's interesting that in part of this discussion, you seem to be moving slightly in the direction of intelligent design theory. And you say in your book that you are sympathetic to some of their arguments, but that there are weaknesses with their approach as well. Could you describe your attitude towards intelligent design?
Yes, I believe in intelligent design for obvious reasons, because I believe that God has designed the laws of nature and nature itself,
yes.
And everything we find in nature. He is the one who upholds all things by the word of his power, we read in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3. And that means, in a sense, that God is instantaneously responsible for the laws of nature. They are, if you like, the utterances of his purpose and intention. So I do believe in intelligent design. But those who advocate intelligent design are not coming at it from a theistic point of view. What they are trying to say is that there is evidence in nature of design, of intelligent design. And, of course, the prime example of that is the one we've already talked about, the genetic code and the fact of information lying at the root of life itself.
Yes.
So they are deliberately not invoking theistic ideas. They're not invoking God. Although, of course, in invoking an intelligent designer, they are opening the door to a supernatural being.
Sure.
But the chief weakness, I think, in my mind, is simply that they do not identify the designer. And to some extent, there is a danger in that. The latest thinking in intelligent design, it seems to me, at least as I read the publications, is that evolution can be credited with almost everything, just as evolution itself claims that life and the complexity of life that we know today, and intelligence and mind, the emergence of mind, all these things can be explained in terms of evolution, just as Darwin said it could be. But somewhere in there, you've got to incorporate a tweaking of situations of things on a molecular level, for example. One of the leading exponents of intelligent design, Michael Baer, has written a book quite recently in which he says, well, lots of things can happen by evolutionary mechanisms, but there are certain things that could not possibly have happened on the relevant time scale just by Darwinian mechanisms. Too many mutations of the right kind would have had to happen in a short time to produce a new organ, for example, a real advance in the complexity of life. So they finish up by swallowing the theory of evolution, hook, line, and sinker, and saying, but evolution was guided at this point, not at that point, but at this point and another point. And it seems to me that's a very weak position, because Lewis Carroll's Cheshire Cat gradually disappeared, leaving only the smile behind. It seems to me that they're minimizing the creative acts of the intelligent designer. They're trying to get them down to the absolute minimum, whereas the approach that I have taken, which is a full-blooded biblical theistic case, is quite the reverse, that all things are the work of God. And you can't explain the origin of natural law and the mathematical nature of the laws that govern the universe by intelligent design. Intelligent design is a very limited theory, limited to certain aspects of evolution. So it doesn't, to my mind, provide a satisfactory answer to the big question.
Aha, I see. But you would nevertheless believe that it's useful within the scientific establishment to ask questions of this nature?
Yes, that's right. It has a contribution to make, and I read the intelligent design literature with great interest and find it very stimulating because they're asking the right questions. How did the genetic code arise? How is it that information could be generated from chaos? Well, it can't. Therefore, we must ascribe these things to an intelligent designer. To some extent, they're doing the same as I'm doing, in the sense that they're coming up against the boundaries of scientific explanation and finding that science can't take them across those boundaries. Then they say, well, you've got to explain these in a different way. Of course, it does lay them open to the charge of evoking the God of the gaps. Just when you come to something that science can't explain, well, you say, well, that's God.
Well, is that quite fair? Because they don't actually...
No, it's not at all fair. I say it lays them open to it.
Yes, indeed. And you haven't done that, but that would be to mischaracterize their position, certainly. What you're saying about creation does seem to entail that miracle actually does take place in the real world. And in the book, you do seem to suggest that there are many theologians today who think that miracles are, indecent, really. Many people say that view diminishes God in some way, makes him out to be an imperfect creator. But you don't have any problem with miracles, do you?
No, not at all. I'm skeptical of many things that people claim to be miracles today. I'm quite a skeptic as far as a particular event being described as miraculous. But it seems to me that, you've got the origin of the universe, well, that's got to be a miracle in the sense that there is no scientific explanation of it and the other things we've been talking about. But my position is a very radical position, a very biblical position, which I think many theists even would hesitate to adopt. And that is that not only miracles, but everything that happens are directly under the control, moment-by-moment control of God. And I base this upon biblical statements such as the one I quoted earlier from Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3, where we're told that Jesus Christ upholds all things by the word of his power. And there's another verse in Colossians chapter 1, which says, in Christ all things consist or hold together their integrity. The integrity of all things is clearly speaking in a cosmological sense. The integrity of all things owes its existence to Christ and his will. And therefore, if you follow these verses, then it means that the normal operation of natural law is the moment-by-moment operation of the mind of God, of the will of God.
So in a sense, they should be called regularities then, rather than laws.
That's right, operating in a regular way. And if you adopt that position, then the miraculous falls into place. It is no longer some special intervention by God into a self-sustaining natural order. Most people think of a miracle as God interfering with a natural order that he has set in place and doesn't usually have any control over. But if you see that the natural order and the normal workings of the universe are emanations, if you like, of the mind of God, then the miracle is exactly the same. It's just an irregular or non-repetitive situation that God ordains momentarily in time and space to achieve a certain purpose, such as the resurrection of Jesus Christ, of course.
Yes.
That's the great central miracle of the Christian faith.
And this presumably would lead you to deny the kind of view of, say, somebody like Stephen Jay Gould with his non-overlapping magisteria position, where he says that there are equal explanations. Some are religious explanations and other are scientific explanations. They're both equally valid, but they have nothing to do with each other.
Yes. I mean, the non-overlapping magisteria sometimes referred to as complementarity, that, you can give a scientific explanation of something, you can give a divine explanation of something. They're quite compatible with the position I'm advancing. It's just the position I'm advancing takes a higher, more overarching view of the whole thing.
So I must ask you, do you subscribe to a 6-day creationist position and a young Earth position on creation?
Well, I don't know how long you want to talk about this. This is getting us into a situation where Christians and even creationists don't see eye to eye. And
sure.
The reason is, of course, that there are different ways of interpreting the Genesis account, particularly Genesis chapter 1.
Yes, absolutely.
What I'd like to say is this. While I have my own views, I respect any view that can genuinely be justified from Scripture. That's the first point. I have two sticking points, two red lines, if you like. I insist that the account of creation given in the book of Genesis is historical. That is, it actually happened and is not mythological.
Mm-hmm.
And the second point is that you cannot explain creation without invoking miracle. We can define that as an event that cannot and never will have a scientific explanation. Those are my sticking points. And when we come to the interpretation of the days of creation, the sequence of creation, whether or not Genesis 1 is compatible with Big Bang kind of origin of the universe, I believe it is, because I think that the origin of the universe is described in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and that from verse 2 onwards, the narrative is restricted to the earth. It is an earthbound viewpoint from verse 2 onwards. And I think actually that is a much more coherent interpretation of Genesis chapter 1. And by the way, this isn't just my own idea. I'm following the esteemed Hebrew scholar E.J. Young. He said that the first verse was the description of the original creation, including the heavens and the earth, which of course allows for a Big Bang. And he insisted that from verse 2 onwards, the description was earthbound, so that, for example, the appearance of the sun and the moon and the stars on day 4 was an appearance. It wasn't a reference to the de novo creation of those heavenly bodies. So, I have my own coherent interpretation of Genesis 1, which does allow for a Big Bang type of creation. Whether the days are literal days or not is another big issue. We have to bear in mind that the chapter we're interpreting, Genesis chapter 1, actually defines what it means by a day. It says God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So when we read about days in Genesis 1, using the internal definition of day, we're talking about periods of light, and not necessarily periods measured in hours as we understand them today. But again, I do try not to be dogmatic on this, because I do recognize that there are variant interpretations which are equally valid.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So, I don't start a fist fight with a person who differs from me.
No, so there are many people who say that the Hebrew Yom does refer to many different periods of time, and so therefore it could be great expanses of time rather than just 24-hour periods. But presumably on those days, you would say that God did actually engage in special creation on those particular days,
yes.
Those particular periods of time.
Yes. I think there's a mixture. You see, my view that the heavenly bodies appeared on day 4 rather than were created on day 4, and that, of course, is the emphasis in the text. God set the heavenly bodies in the heavens. People then say, well, you're diminishing the miraculous element. You're just talking about cloud cover clearing so that things become visible. And that's not miraculous. Well, of course, it can be miraculous, depending on how fast and in what manner the cloud cover cleared. But earlier you've got the separation of the land and the waters, which is a separation. The appearance of dry land was an appearance. The land was there already. It only became visible as the waters receded from it. And that, to my mind, is completely analogous to the heavenly bodies becoming visible. They were there, but they become visible.
Yes, there are people who talk about a pattern of separations that appear in the text.
Yes, that's right.
And so this would be a separation here of the lights in the sky and the separation of them from the cloud cover that might be there. So there'd be just another instance of that literary device that's being used throughout the text.
Yes, yes, indeed. But equally, the creation of the different kinds of organism, of animal life, I see as miraculous. So I see a mixture of natural and miraculous in Genesis 1. I don't think you can say it's all miraculous, and I don't think you can say it's all non-miraculous.
Mm-hmm. Well, I must ask you how people can most easily get hold of a copy of your book. I suspect that it's available on Amazon. Is there any other way that people can get hold of it? Because from what you've said, it's not easily available in the local bookshops.
I think Christian bookshops will have it, but they're not all that thick on the ground these days. It's available by mail order from the publisher. That's www.epbooks.org. And it's available from a number of online book suppliers. The hardcover edition is sold out. You won't get the hardcover, the orange cover edition any longer. It's now available in paperback, which has got a yellow cover, and it's also available in electronic format, particularly the Amazon Kindle format. Much, much cheaper if you buy it as an electronic book.
And you have a website too, don't you, which I think is named after the book. Could you tell us the address of that website?
Yes, that is easy to remember. www.whomadegod, as a single word, no question mark, whomadegod.org, O-R-G. And on that website, by the way, there are quite a number of articles which go beyond the book and deal with, for example, with books that have been published by atheists, like the more recent book by Stephen Hawking, The Grand Design. I have a review of that book on the website, but of course that was published after my book, so they're not mentioned in the book. Although many of the topics, actually, interestingly, are dealt with in my book, because the Hawking book is not actually very original, reproducing a lot of arguments that were already out there.
Well, I really do think that your book would be certainly very useful for anybody who's looking into Christianity and asking the kinds of questions that you are seeking to address.
Yes.
Is it true that Christianity presents a coherent worldview? I think it would be very helpful for that, but also I think very informative for the believer as well, and helping to give us confidence in what we believe.
That's right.
Does cohere with the real world. And I think also it does model a very persuasive and appealing apologetical approach too. So I'm very grateful for sending me the book. I enjoyed it very much. And so may I say, Professor Andrews, it has been wonderful to speak to you. It's not always easy territory for a layperson like me to deal with, but I thank you for being gentle with me. So thank you very much indeed for sparing the time to talk to us.
It's been my pleasure.